There are moments that divide a life cleanly in two, before and after, and they rarely arrive with warning. They arrive, instead, at supper. Helena Carrington, Countess of Brackenhurst, had known for 11 months what her husband had done, and for 11 months she had said nothing. She had managed his household, raised his son, poured his wine, and smiled at his cousin across a candlelit table, all while the knowledge sat inside her like a stone that had slowly become part of her architecture. She had not been suffering in silence. She had been preparing, and on a cold Tuesday evening in late February, with a bread knife in her hand and a dining room full of guests around her, Lady Helena Carrington decided that the preparation was complete. She raised her eyes to Alistair's face and she spoke. What happened next, to him, to her, to the girl in Bristol, who did not yet know her name would change, is a story about the cost of silence, the courage of truth, and whether a love built on a lie can be rebuilt on something that will hold. The supper at Brackenhurst Hall had been arranged with no particular ambition. Late February was no season for ceremony, and the guest list reflected it. Lady Constance Carrington, Alistair's aunt, who required no invitation and rarely waited for one. Mr. and Mrs. Fellows from the neighboring estate, reliable conversationalists both, and young Reverend Hatch, whose presence Helena had arranged because Oliver adored him and because a clergyman at the table kept Constance from her sharper observations. The dining room was lit well enough, the fire adequate, the soup unremarkable. Oliver sat between Helena and the Reverend, chattering about a rabbit he had seen that afternoon near the kitchen garden. Constance was explaining the precise reason why the northern hunting parties had declined since Lord Ashby's management of them, and Mr. Fellows was nodding with the practiced patience of a man who had been nodding at Constance Carrington for 30 years. Alistair sat at the head of the table. Helena sat at the foot. They had sat this way for 8 years. She reached for the breadboard when Oliver asked for more, and she lifted the knife with the unhurried ease of a woman who had performed this gesture 10,000 times. The blade was sharp. She pressed it through the loaf with slow, even pressure, watching the crust yield cleanly, and then she raised her eyes to her husband's face across the length of the table. She did not raise her voice. She did not alter her expression by a single degree. She simply looked at him and said it, quietly enough that no one beyond him could have heard the words above Constance's account of Lord Ashby's mismanagement. "I know what you did." The knife completed its stroke. A clean slice fell to the board. Constance laughed at something Oliver had said. The rabbit, apparently, had been attempting to eat the parsley. Alistair's wineglass struck his plate. Not a crash, not a shatter. A small, sharp sound. The kind that registers in a room's particular silence between one sentence and the next. The footman standing behind Alistair's chair heard it. Helena heard it. No one else appeared to. She set the knife down, lifted the slice, and passed the bread to Oliver. "Would anyone care for more?" she asked, addressing the table with the ease of a woman whose hands had never trembled. Alistair attempted to answer Mr. Fellows's question about the hunting season. He had been asked whether the East Wood was still worth the effort in March, and it was the kind of question he could have answered in his sleep on any other evening. His voice broke mid-sentence. Not dramatically, nothing so visible as that. A small fracture, a pause where no pause belonged. And then the sentence continued, technically complete, entirely hollow. He set down his knife. He did not pick it up again. The supper continued for another 40 minutes. Oliver ate 2 more slices of bread and described the rabbit's ears in considerable detail to Reverend Hatch. Constance moved from Lord Ashby's hunting mismanagement to the price of coal, which she considered unconscionable. Mr. and Mrs. Fellows agreed that it was. Helena asked Mrs. Fellows about her daughter's progress on the pianoforte, and listened to the answer with every appearance of genuine interest. Alistair spoke twice more. once to agree that the price of coal was indeed unconscionable, once to confirm that the East wood was worth the effort in March. Both times his voice was steady. Both times his hands remained flat on the table beside his unused knife. When the guests had gone and Oliver had been taken up to bed by his nurse, and Constance had retired to the blue room she occupied, whenever she decided to stay the night without consulting anyone, Helena went to her writing room at the end of the east corridor and closed the door. She opened her private journal, a small leather volume that lived in the locked drawer of her desk, and wrote a single line in her precise, unhurried hand. She wrote, "I have begun." She closed the journal, locked the drawer, and went to bed. Alistair did not sleep. He lay in the dark of his dressing room. He had moved there 6 months ago, quietly, on a night when Helena had said nothing, and he had understood that nothing was what she required. And he stared at the ceiling while the fire burned down, listening to the hall settle around him. And he held the 6 words she had said in his mind, and turned them over and over, and could not find a way they meant anything other than exactly what they were. 3 days passed before he came to her. Helena was at her writing desk when the knock came. A single knock, which was unusual. Alistair generally announced himself with 2. She said, "Come in," without looking up from the letter she was writing, and she heard him enter and stop just inside the door. "Helena," he said. She continued writing. Behind her, visible on the open shelving that lined the east wall, were 11 months of correspondence, neatly labeled, precisely ordered, the accumulated architecture of a woman who had been very busy while appearing to be merely domestic. He would see it. She had arranged it so that he would. "What did you mean?" he said, "at supper?" It was not quite a question. She finished the sentence she was writing, set down her pen, and folded her hands on the desk before her. She still did not look at him. "I will tell you when I am ready," she said. "You have had 10 years. You can wait a fortnight." The quiet that settled behind her was absolute. "Have you told anyone?" he asked. She answered simply, "No." "Do you intend to?" "That," Helena said, "depends entirely on what kind of man you turn out to be in the next 14 days. She heard him move, not toward her, but slightly to the side, and she knew without turning that he was looking at the locked drawer of her desk, and at the papers beneath her hand, and at the Bristol postmark visible on the topmost envelope. She had not hidden it. She had not needed to. He left without another word. She listened to his footsteps in the corridor. They stopped. A long pause. She counted 30 seconds by the clock on the mantelpiece. And then they continued, and faded, and were gone. Helena picked up her pen and returned to the letter. In the corridor, Alistair had stopped because his legs had simply declined to carry him further for a moment. He stood with one hand against the wall, and understood with the clarity of a man who has spent 8 years not understanding because not understanding was more comfortable, that Helena had not stumbled onto a half-truth in a letter she was never meant to read. She had built something. The woman he had been failing to see for 8 years of marriage had been preparing for this conversation with the same methodical competence she brought to everything else in his household. And she had been doing it for longer than he had been avoiding the conversation. And he had not noticed, because he had not been looking. He walked on, denied the conversation he had half dreaded and half craved. Alistair did the only thing available to him. He watched. He had not, he was beginning to understand, been watching for a very long time. He watched Helena manage Oliver's tutors, the firm, specific instructions she gave, the follow-up questions she asked a week later that demonstrated she had been monitoring progress in the interim. He noticed the locked writing room drawer for the first time, though it had presumably been locked for months. He observed 2 brief absences he could not account for. One Thursday afternoon, when she had gone out in the carriage and returned 3 hours later with no explanation offered and none requested. And one morning, when a letter arrived by special messenger, and she had taken it directly to the writing room and not emerged for 2 hours. He noted the Bristol correspondence, the unfamiliar solicitor's seal on 2 of the envelopes, the particular care with which she filed everything away. He did not investigate. He understood, with absolute clarity, that to send a man to Bristol or to bribe a messenger or to pick the lock on that drawer would be to forfeit whatever standing he still possessed in this house. And that standing was the only ground he had left to stand on. Instead, alone in his study after midnight when the hall was quiet, he began for the first time in 10 years to put into words what he had done at 28. He drafted a letter to Marcus. He got 3 sentences in before he understood that the letter was a performance. Another version of the private atonement he had been conducting for a decade. The quiet payments to Marcus's creditors, the anonymous trust for a woman Marcus had once mentioned in a letter from the Colonial Post. And he burned it before dawn. He drafted a second letter. This one was more honest. He got further before the honesty became unbearable. And he burned that one too. The third letter he began at 2 in the morning, sitting at his desk in the frost-cold study with the fire burning low. And he wrote nothing at all for 20 minutes. He simply held the pen and thought about Marcus standing before the regimental board with his back straight and his voice level, naming himself the officer who had broken ranks. He thought about what that had cost. He thought about Marcus's face in the weeks before the board convened, and the one conversation they had had, the only conversation, in which Marcus had said simply, "I have considered the matter, and this is what will happen." And Alistair had said nothing, because saying nothing was easier than any of the alternatives, and he had been 28 years old and terrified. And Marcus had been 32 and certain. Marcus had been dead of colonial fever for 8 years. Alistair burned the third letter still half blank. He sat at the desk until the fire went out, and then he sat in the dark. He had been performing the earldom for a decade. The responsible management, the quiet reparations, the dignified public face. He had been performing the atonement too, in private, in ways that cost him money, but never required him to speak. He had been performing the marriage, he supposed, though he had not thought of it in those terms before. And now a woman with perfectly steady hands had looked at him across a dinner table and said 6 words, and he could not perform any of it any more, because she was watching, and she could see. Helena made her first Bristol trip on a Thursday, and she returned late. It had rained since afternoon, and she came through the front door soaked through, the hem of her traveling cloak heavy with it, her hair dark against her face. Alistair was in the front hall. He had been in the front hall, or near it, for the better part of 2 hours, moving between the hall and the study and the hall again with no particular purpose beyond the inability to be still. He had not known where she was. He had not asked, because asking would have been a kind of trespass, and he was trying very carefully not to trespass. He was standing near the hall table when the door opened. He did not ask where she had been. He crossed to her and unfastened the cloak at her throat, lifted it from her shoulders, and set it aside. Then he went to the hall cupboard, where the household kept spare wraps for exactly this kind of English evening. And he took out a dry shawl, dark wool, one of Helena's own, and carried it back and placed it around her shoulders. He was careful. His hands did not touch her skin. "Will you eat?" he asked. Helena looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face, not warmth exactly, but recognition of the gesture. She answered quietly, "Yes." The footman had been dismissed for the evening. Helena, at supper, gave a quiet nod when she saw him hovering near the door, and he withdrew. They ate together at one end of the long dining table, the two of them at the corner where the candlelight was sufficient, and the rest of the table stretched away into shadow. Neither spoke. The food was simple, whatever the kitchen had prepared, and they ate it with the careful attention of two people who were using the meal as a reason to be in the same room. When Helena set down her fork, Alistair did not speak. When she rose to leave, he did not follow. He returned to the study and sat with the unlit fire and the dark window, and did not draft a letter or open a book. He thought about the shawl and the way she had said yes, and whether those two things together constituted anything he was permitted to call hope. He decided they did not. He decided, sitting in the dark, that he was not entitled to hope. He was entitled to wait and to be present and to not make things worse, and that was the full extent of his entitlement. In her room, Helena sat at her dressing table and allowed herself a memory she had been keeping at a careful distance. 8 years ago, 2 months before their wedding, at a dinner at which Constance Carrington had been particularly pointed about Helena's modest origins. The Baron's second son, the reduced circumstances, the fortune that was adequate but not distinguished. Constance had not been cruel in any way that could be named. She had simply been Constance, which was worse. Helena had been sitting very still, her hands in her lap, working to keep her face composed, when she had felt a hand close over hers beneath the table. Not dramatically. Simply, Alistair's hand, finding hers, and staying there for the rest of the course. She had thought then, with a conviction that had not wavered for years, "This man is kind." She held the memory now, in the candlelight, and examined it from every angle available to her. She did not put it away. She simply set it down, carefully, and went to bed. Anne's letter arrived on a Wednesday morning. Helena had been expecting it. She had written to Anne's guardian 2 weeks prior, and the response had come through the Bristol solicitor. But the sight of the girl's own handwriting on the envelope, careful and slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone who had taught herself, stopped Helena in the act of opening it. She sat down. She opened the letter. Anne did not ask for money. She did not ask for recognition or an explanation or any of the things Helena had been prepared to address. The letter was short, 3 paragraphs, the third one shorter than the others, and it contained one question. Was my father the kind of man who would have wanted me? Helena read it twice. She set it on the desk. She looked at the window, where the February light was doing nothing in particular, and then something in her chest that had been held in position by 11 months of deliberate effort simply gave way, and she wept. She did not weep for Alistair. She did not weep for herself, or for the marriage she had believed she was building on solid ground, or for Marcus, who had been a quiet presence in her early life and a name she had carried without examining too closely. She wept for the 14-year-old girl sitting in a cold workroom above a milliner's shop in Bristol, with a question that deserved an answer, and for the fact that the only person alive who could answer it was the man who had let her father die. When it was over, she opened the locked drawer. She removed the stack of correspondence she had been building since November, the dying officer's letter, the regimental records, the solicitor's documents, the notes from her Bristol inquiries. And she placed Anne's letter on top of the pile. She looked at it for a long moment. The 2-week deadline had been, until this morning, a question of whether Helena would speak. It was no longer that. It was a question of how she would speak and what the conversation must accomplish. Because the conversation that was coming needed to produce a man capable of sitting across from a 14-year-old girl in a cold parlor above a milliner's shop and giving her an honest answer to an honest question. Helena was not certain Alistair was that man yet. She intended to find out. The solicitor mentioned it in passing. He had come to Brackenhurst to review the quarterly accounts, a routine visit, nothing remarkable. And at the end of the meeting, gathering his papers, he had said, almost as an afterthought, that he understood Lady Brackenhurst had been making certain inquiries through a Bristol firm regarding a deed of acknowledgement. He had said it in the tone of a man conveying information he assumed was already known. He had said good day and left. Alistair dismissed him and sat without moving for a considerable time. He understood what a deed of acknowledgement was. He understood what it meant that Helena had been pursuing one through her own solicitor, separately, without reference to him. He understood that she had not been waiting for his permission or his cooperation. She had been building a structure that would function whether he participated or not, and the only variable was whether he would be present in it. He went to her writing room. He had been crying, not recently, but recently enough that his face showed it. He did not attempt to conceal this. He knocked once and opened the door at her voice, and he stood just inside the threshold and looked at her. "May I sit?" he asked. Helena looked up from her desk. She looked at his face. She said simply, "Yes." He crossed the room and sat down beside her, not in the chair across the desk, which would have put the desk between them like a negotiating table, but in the chair beside her, the one Oliver sometimes occupied when he came to watch her write. He sat and he looked at his hands, and after a long silence, he placed his right hand over hers where it rested on the desk. She did not pull away. She did not return the pressure. She sat with her hand beneath his and looked at the papers in front of her, and neither of them spoke. They remained like that for several minutes. Then Alistair rose, quietly, and left the room without speaking. 2 days later, Lady Constance Carrington arrived. She came unannounced, which was her custom, and she was in the morning room before anyone had managed to send word to Helena that she was in the house. Helena found her there, standing at the window with her back to the door, which was also her custom when she wished to establish that the room belonged to her. "I have heard things," Constance said, without turning around. "Good morning, Constance," Helena replied, and sat down. Constance turned. She was a handsome woman, 60 years old, and she wore her authority the way other women wore their best jewels, constantly, and with the clear expectation that everyone in the room would notice. "There are rumors," she said, "about inquiries being made, about Bristol, about certain documents." She paused. "I want to know whether the Carrington name is about to be made a subject of public discussion." Helena folded her hands in her lap. "The Carrington name," she said, "has been carrying a concealed scandal for a decade. I am preparing to give that scandal the dignity of being faced." Constance's expression did not change, precisely, but something behind it sharpened. "You will not," she said. "I will," Helena said pleasantly. "Helena." Constance moved to the chair across from her and sat, which meant she was preparing to be serious. "You do not understand what you are risking. The Carrington position, Alistair's standing in this county, Oliver's prospects, your own place in this family, all of it depends on a reputation that has been carefully maintained. Whatever you think you know." "I know precisely what happened," Helena said. "I have known for 11 months. I have the letter from the officer who was present. I have the regimental records. I know what Marcus testified to, and I know what Alistair did not. What followed was the longest pause Constance Carrington had produced in Helena's experience of her. "If you proceed with this," Constance said, "I will withdraw every form of support I have provided to this household. Financial, social, legal. Every connection I have maintained on Alistair's behalf. Every door I have opened, every obligation I have called in. All of it gone. You will find yourselves quite alone." Helena looked at her for a moment. Then she stood, crossed to the bell pull, and rang for the footman. "Thank you, Constance," she said, "for making your position so clear. I'll have James bring the carriage." That same afternoon, Helena went back to Bristol. This time she was not going to make inquiries or review documents. She was going to see Anne. The parlor above the milliner's shop was small and cold, the fire insufficient for the room, the furniture decent but worn in the way of furnished rooms that have housed many different people's lives. Anne was already seated when Helena came in. A girl of 14, dark-haired, small-boned, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned early that drawing attention to themselves is not always safe. She looked nothing like Marcus. She looked entirely like the woman described in his last letter from the Colonial Post, the woman whose name had been in the dying officer's account. Anne watched Helena sit down with the careful attention of someone accustomed to making quick assessments of strangers. "How is the work?" Helena asked. Anne blinked, apparently having expected something else. "It's steady," she said. "Mrs. Hartley is fair. Do you find it interesting?" A pause. "Sometimes. The French styles are." Another pause. "Are you going to tell me what's happening?" "Not yet," Helena said honestly. "There are things that need to happen first. But I wanted to meet you." Anne studied her. "Why?" "Because you asked a question in your letter that matters," Helena said. "And I want you to know that the question has been heard." Anne was quiet for a moment. "Can you answer it?" "Not I," Helena said. "But I am going to put you in a room with a person who can, if he proves to be the right kind of man." She met the girl's eyes. "I believe he may be. I am not yet certain." Anne looked at her steadily. "And if he's not?" "Then you will never have to see him again," Helena said. "And the acknowledgement will still be executed, and the settlement will still be yours, because those things do not depend on him being the right kind of man. Only the rest of it does." Anne nodded slowly, as though filing this information in a place she would return to later. She did not ask what the rest of it was. She was, Helena thought, a perceptive girl. Helena returned to Brackenhurst that evening with one decision settled entirely in her mind. Whatever Alistair's response to what was coming, Anne would be acknowledged. The only question that remained open was whether the marriage would survive the acknowledgement. 4 nights before the appointed hour, Oliver woke screaming. It was past 2 in the morning. Helena was out of bed before the sound had fully registered, her feet on the cold floor, her dressing gown half-fastened, moving down the corridor toward the nursery. She was 3 steps from Oliver's door when she became aware of footsteps at the other end of the corridor. Alistair, coming from the direction of the study, still dressed, a candle in his hand. They reached Oliver's door at the same moment and went in together without speaking. The boy was sitting up in bed, rigid with the remnants of whatever dream had taken him, his eyes wide and his breathing ragged. Helena sat on his left side and took his hand. Alistair sat on his right and placed his palm flat against the boy's back. A steady pressure, warm and certain. Oliver looked between them, and some of the rigidity went out of his small frame. "All right," Alistair said quietly. "All right. We're here." They sat like that, one hand each on the child, until Oliver's breathing steadied and his eyes grew heavy, and he slid back down against his pillow and slept. Neither Helena nor Alistair spoke during this time. There was nothing to say that would not have disturbed the boy. They rose together and went back out into the corridor. Alistair pulled Oliver's door almost closed, and they stood in the dark with the candle between them, and Helena looked at her husband's face in the unsteady light. "Tomorrow night," she said. "Your study. Midnight." Alistair looked at her. She held out her hand, and he took it. Both of them holding the gesture for the length of one breath, one complete inhale and exhale. And then she stepped back. "Good night," she said, and went inside. Alistair stood in the corridor until the candle in his hand burned down to the holder and went out. She came to his study at midnight. The fire had been built up. She had sent word to the housekeeper that the study would be in use late, which had caused no comment, because Helena Carrington's instructions never invited comment. The room was warm and lit, the frost working at the window glass, and Alistair was standing when she entered, which meant he had not been able to sit. Helena placed 3 things on his desk. The first was a letter, a single page, the handwriting shaky with illness, the date 18 months old. She had carried it since November. "This is from a Captain Aldous Vane," she said. "He was at the court-martial. He was dying when he wrote it, and he wrote it to me because he had known Marcus at school and because he believed someone in the family should know what actually occurred. He asked me to decide what to do with the knowledge." She set it down. "I decided." The second was a folded document, several pages, official in character, bearing a regimental seal. "These are the records of the board. Marcus's testimony is recorded on the 3rd page. He testified alone. There is no record of any other witness, any corroborating account, any second officer present at the moment described. The board accepted his account because Marcus was known to be a man of unimpeachable character." She placed it beside the letter. "They accepted it because he had earned that reputation over 12 years of genuine service, and he spent it in one morning to protect you." The third was a sealed envelope, smaller, lighter, the handwriting careful and slightly uneven. "This is from Anne," she said. "I have not opened it. It is addressed to you." Alistair looked at the 3 objects on his desk. He did not move. "I am going to tell you what you did," Helena said. "Not because I am angry, though I have been, and not to punish you, because punishment is not what this is. I am telling you because the silence is what has corrupted everything we built together. Every room in this house has been shaped around a thing we could not name, and I am not willing to live in those rooms anymore." She paused. She had rehearsed none of this. She had thought about it for 11 months, and then she had trusted herself to speak. "At 28 years old," she said, "you panicked under fire. You broke ranks. Your brother, who commanded the regiment and who loved you, stood before a military board and named himself the man who had done what you did. He was stripped of his commission. He was sent to a colonial post. He died there of fever 2 years later. He was 34 years old." She looked at Alistair's face. His hands were flat on the desk. "He had spoken of me to you. You knew that. You married me 3 years after his death. And I have always believed that you did it, partly because you thought that giving me a good life would constitute some form of repair." Alistair said nothing. His jaw moved once, and then was still. "Forgiveness is not mine to give," Helena said. "What you did was not done to me. It was done to Marcus, who is dead, and to Anne, who is 14 and has asked one question that only you can answer. I cannot forgive on their behalf." She straightened. "But I can tell you what I require, and you can decide what kind of man you intend to be from this point forward." She held up one finger. "You will write a full account of what happened, in your own hand, signed, witnessed by my solicitor, to be held until Oliver reaches 18. He will know who his uncle was and what his father did. That is not negotiable." A second finger. "You will come with me to Bristol and execute the deed of acknowledgement for Anne before a witness. She will have a legal settlement, her schooling, and the right to use the Carrington name if she chooses. That is also not negotiable." She lowered her hand. "The third thing is not a legal matter. If you wish to remain my husband, if you wish us to find out whether this marriage can be rebuilt on ground that includes the truth, then you will speak Marcus's name aloud in this house, at the table, in front of Oliver, regularly, until it stops being the silence that sits with us at every meal." She looked at him steadily. "Those are my terms." Alistair had not moved. He stood with his hands flat on the desk and his face entirely open. No performance, no management. Nothing between his expression and whatever was happening behind it. He wept once, briefly, not with drama. His face simply did what it did for a moment, and then he steadied. He reached for Anne's sealed letter. He broke the seal with hands that were not steady, and he read it. Then he looked up at Helena, and he read it aloud, in a voice that was rough at the edges but did not break. "Was my father the kind of man who would have wanted me?" He set the letter down. "Yes," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "He was exactly that kind of man." Then he looked at Helena. "I accept your terms," he said. "All three. Without modification. Without conditions." Helena looked at him for a long moment. "Then we go to Bristol," she said. "In 1 week." The parlor above the milliner's shop was the same cold room Helena had sat in a week before. The fire was no better. The furniture was no different. But the quality of the air in it was unlike anything Helena had experienced, because the man sitting across from Anne was not performing anything at all. Alistair had brought nothing. No solicitor to speak for him, no gifts, no prepared remarks. He sat in the chair across from the girl, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and then he spoke. "My name is Alistair Carrington," he said. "Marcus was my brother. He was older than me by 4 years, and he commanded the regiment I served in, and I was afraid." He did not look away from Anne's face. "In my first engagement, under fire, I broke ranks. I ran. What I did could have cost lives, and it would certainly have cost me my commission and my freedom when the board convened." He paused. Marcus went before the board and testified that it was he who had broken ranks. He spent his reputation, which he had built over 12 years of genuine service, to protect me. I let him. I said nothing. I stood aside while he was stripped of everything he had earned, and I told myself, for a long time, that I could not have stopped him. He stopped. I could have stopped him. I chose not to. Anne had not moved. She was watching him the way she had watched Helena, the careful, assessing attention of someone who knew the value of information and intended to collect all of it before deciding anything. He was sent to the Colonial Post. Alistair continued. He died there 2 years later. He was 34. He reached into his coat and placed the deed on the table between them. This document acknowledges you as Marcus Carrington's daughter. It establishes a legal settlement, enough for your schooling and your start, and more if you need it. It gives you the right to the Carrington name if you want it. and no obligation to use it if you don't. He did not touch the deed once it was on the table. You may sign it or refuse it. You may accept the settlement or not. You may see us again or not. Every door is yours. I am not asking you for anything. Anne looked at the deed. She looked at Alistair. She looked at Helena briefly, and then back at Alistair. Was he afraid? She asked. Alistair was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. Not of dying. He wrote to me from the Colonial Post, once near the end, and he said he was afraid of leaving people unprotected. He held Anne's gaze. He meant you. He didn't name you. But I know now that he meant you. Anne looked down at the table. She reached for the deed and signed it, with the careful, slightly uneven handwriting that Helena recognized from the letter about her father. She set the pen down and pushed the document back across the table. She did not embrace him. She did not weep. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the fire for a moment, and then she looked at Helena. "I'll write," she said, "when I'm ready." On the train back from Bristol, Helena did not speak. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the countryside move past the window in the gray, late afternoon light. And Alistair sat across from her and did not press her for anything. They arrived at Brackenhurst in the pre-dawn hours, before the household was stirring. The carriage came through the gates and stopped at the front steps, and the coachman went to see to the horses, and Helena and Alistair stood at the front door in the gray early light with no one else present. Helena turned to him. "I don't yet know," she said, "whether I can love you as I did, before I knew." Alistair looked at her. His face was tired and entirely honest. "I wouldn't ask you to," he said. "I would only ask to remain in the house with you while we find out. That's all." Helena looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed to him and kissed him, once, slowly, with both her hands against his chest. It was not absolution. It was not a return to where they had been before. It was something else entirely. A beginning that had the full weight of everything they now both knew behind it and was stronger for it. The social cost arrived in the weeks that followed, and it arrived exactly as Constance had promised. At the spring assembly, Lady Constance Carrington looked directly through Helena and Alistair, as though they were features of the wallpaper. 3 invitations were withdrawn, without explanation. The Carrington family solicitor sent a formal letter of resignation. Helena's solicitor, a capable man from Bristol, took his place without ceremony. Alistair bore all of it without complaint, which Helena noted. He did not minimize it, or pretend it was less than it was, or suggest that she had brought it upon them. He simply bore it. 6 months on, Helena passed the open door of Oliver's room one evening and stopped. Alistair was sitting on the edge of the bed, reading aloud from a book, a small volume, blue cloth cover, the spine worn with age. Oliver was propped against his pillow in his nightgown, listening with the focused attention he brought to things that genuinely interested him. Alistair paused at the bottom of a page, and Helena heard him say, quietly and without particular ceremony, "This was your Uncle Marcus's favorite chapter." Oliver looked up. "Who is Uncle Marcus?" Alistair set the book down on the coverlet. He sat for a moment, finding the words. "Uncle Marcus was my brother," he said. "He was a very brave man. He took a punishment that wasn't his to take, because he wanted to protect me. And I am still, every day, trying to be worth what he did." He looked at Oliver steadily. "You should know his name, because you carry some of what he was. In here." He touched the boy's chest, briefly with 2 fingers. "The good parts." Oliver considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old who understands that he has been told something important. "Will you read the chapter?" he asked. Alistair picked up the book. "Yes," he said, and read. 1 year after the evening of the bread, the dining room at Brackenhurst Hall was transformed. The long table, that great mahogany expanse across which Helena had looked at her husband and spoken 6 words that changed everything, was gone. Helena had requested its removal in the spring, and Alistair had arranged it without comment or question. In its place stood a smaller table, round, positioned near the east window, where the afternoon light came in best. It seated 8 comfortably. It seated 4 intimately. Tonight, it seated 5. Anne, 15 now, attending school in Bristol on Alistair's settlement, was visiting for the holiday. She sat beside Oliver, and the two of them were engaged in a discussion about a pony. Apparently, there was a pony at the school, and Oliver had strong opinions about ponies despite having limited experience with them. And Anne was correcting his misconceptions with the patient authority of someone who had recently acquired expertise. Oliver accepted the corrections with a 6-year-old's generous equanimity and asked a follow-up question that made Anne laugh. A genuine laugh, unguarded. The laugh of a girl who had not always been certain she was allowed to take up space. "My cousin Anne knows everything about ponies," Oliver announced to the table, in the tone of someone sharing information of general importance. Alistair, at Helena's left, reached for the wine. Helena, at Alistair's right, was already looking at Anne's face when she laughed, and she allowed herself, quietly, to feel the weight of what the year had cost and what it had produced, and to find that the second outweighed the first. The footman, the same man who had stood behind Alistair's chair 12 months ago and heard a wineglass strike a plate, moved through the room with the practiced invisibility of long service. He refilled glasses, removed plates, attended to the candles as they burned low. He observed, as good footmen do, without comment and without expression. He noticed that the Countess and the Earl sat at the same end of the table this year, side by side, their chairs close enough that their hands met occasionally in the space between the plates. Not dramatically, not with any particular announcement, simply the hands of 2 people who had found their way back to each other across difficult ground and were not inclined to be far apart. He noticed that the Earl's hands, this evening, were perfectly steady. Through the open door of the east corridor, the writing room was visible. The lamp lit, the desk in order, a letter half finished on the blotter. It was addressed, in Helena's hand, to the sexton of a small churchyard in the north of England, making arrangements for 2 visitors who intended to come in the spring. To stand at a grave, to say a name aloud in the place where it was owed. The candles burned low. Anne was explaining to Oliver the precise difference between a cob and a hunter. And Oliver was listening with great seriousness, and Alistair was listening too. And Helena watched him listen and thought of a hand finding hers under a table 8 years ago, and of the woman she had been then who had thought, "This man is kind." She had been right. She had simply not yet known the full cost of what kindness would require of him, or of her. Now she knew. And they were still here, at a smaller table, in the same room, beginning again.